Tom Toothacre's Ghost Story by Harriet Beecher Stowe. "What is it about that old house in Sherborne?" said Aunt Nabby to Sam Lawson, as he sat drooping over the coals of a fire one October evening. Aunt Lois was gone to Boston on a visit, and the smart spice of her skepticism being absent, we felt the more freedom to start our storytelling on one of his legends. Aunt Nabby sat trotting her knitting needles on a blue mixed yarn stocking. Grandmamma was knitting in unison at the other side of the fire. Grandfather sat studying the Boston Courier. The wind outside was sighing in fitful wails, creaking the pantry doors, occasionally puffing in a vicious gust down the broad throat of the chimney. It was a drizzly, sleety evening, and the wet lilac bushes now and then rattled and splashed against the window as the wind moaned and whispered through them. We boys had made preparation for a comfortable evening. We had enticed Sam to the chimney corner and drawn him a mug of cider. We had set down a row of apples to roast on the hearth, which even now were giving faint sighs and sputters as their plump sides burst in the genial heat. The big oak backlog simmered and bubbled and distilled large drops down amid the ashes, and the great hickory forestick had just burned out into solid bright coals, faintly skimmed over with white ashes. The whole area of the big chimney was full of a sleepy warmth and brightness just calculated to call forth fancies and visions. It only wanted somebody now to set Sam off, and Aunt Nabby broached the ever-interesting subject of haunted houses. "Well, now, Miss Badger," said Sam, "I been over there and walked round that there house considerable, and I talked with Granny Hokum and Aunt Polly, and they've pretty much come to the conclusion that they'll have to move out on it. You see, these yer noises, they keep 'em awake nights, and Aunt Polly, she gets stericky, and Hannah Jane, she says if they stay in the house, she can't live with 'em no longer. And what can them lone women do without Hannah Jane? Why, Hannah Jane, she says these 2 months past she's seen a woman reg'lar walking up and down the front hall between 12 and 1 o'clock at night, and it's just the image and body of old Ma'am Tillotson, Parks and Hokum's mother, that everybody knowed was a thunderin' kind of woman that kept everything in a muss while she was alive. What the old critter's up to now, there ain't no knowin'. Some folks seems to think it's a sign Granny Hokum's time's comin'. But, Lordy massy, says she to me, says she, 'Why, Sam, I don't know nothing what I've done that Madam Tillotson should be set loose on me.' Anyway, they've all got so nervy that Jed Hokum has been up from Needham and is going to cart 'em all over to live with him. Jed, he's for hushing on it up, 'cause he says it brings a bad name on the property. Well, I talked with Jed about it, and says I to Jed, says I, 'Now, if you'll take my advice, just you give that there old house a regular overhauling, and paint it over with 2 coats of paint, and that there'll clear 'em out if anything will. Ghosts is like bedbugs, they can't stand fresh paint,' says I. They allers clear out. I've seen it tried on a ship that got haunted." "Why, Sam, do ships get haunted?" "To be sure they do. Haunted the worst kind. Why, I could tell you a story'd make your hair rise on end. Only I'm afraid of frightening boys when they're just going to bed." "Oh, you can't frighten Horace," said my grandmother. "He will go and sit out there in the graveyard till 9 o'clock nights, spite of all I tell him." "Do tell, Sam," we urged. "What was it about the ship?" Sam lifted his mug of cider, deliberately turned it round and round in his hands, eyed it affectionately, took a long drink, and set it down in front of him on the hearth, and began. "You 'member I telled you how I went to sea down east when I was a boy, 'long with Tom Toothacre? Well, Tom, he reeled off a yarn one night that was about the toughest I ever had the pulling on, and it come all straight, too, from Tom. 'Twain't none of your hearsay, 'twas what he seen with his own eyes. Now, there wasn't no nonsense about Tom, not a bit on it, and he wasn't afeard on the devil himself, so he generally saw through things about as straight as things could be seen through. This year happened when Tom was mate o' the Albatross, and they was a-running up to the banks for a fare o' fish. The Albatross was as handsome a craft as ever ye see, and Captain Sim Witherspoon, he was skipper, a real nice, likely man he was. I heard Tom tell this year one night to the boys on the Brilliant, when they was all a-settin' round the stove in the cabin one foggy night, that we was to anchor in Frenchman's Bay, and all kind o' layin' off loose. Tom, he said they was havin' a famous run-up to the banks. There was a spankin' southerly that blew 'em along like all nature, and they was havin' the best kind of a time, when this year southerly brought a pesky fog down on 'em, and it grew thicker than hasty puddin'. You see, that there's the pester of these yer southerlies. They's the biggest fog breeders there is goin'. And so, pretty soon, you couldn't see half the ship's length afore you. Well, they all was down to supper, except Dan Sawyer at the wheel, when there come such a crash as if heaven and earth was a-splittin', and then a-scrapin' and bumpin' under the ship, and gin 'em such a hiss that the pot of beans went rollin', and brought up jam agin the bulkhead, and the fellers was keeled over, men and pork and beans, kinder promiscuous. "The devil!" said Tom Toothacre. "We've run down somebody. Look out up there!" Dan, he shoved the helm hard down, and put her up to the wind, and sung out, "Lordy massy, we've struck her right amidships." "Struck what?" they all yelled, and tumbled up on deck. "Why, a little schooner," says Dan. "Didn't see her till we was right on her. She's gone down tack and sheet. Look, there's part of the wreck a-floatin' off, don't you see?" Well, they didn't see, 'cause it was so thick you couldn't hardly see your hand afore your face. But they put about, and sent out a boat, and kind of searched around. But, lordy massy, you might as well look for a drop of water in the Atlantic Ocean. Whoever they was, it was all done gone and over with 'em for this life, poor critters. Tom says they felt confoundedly about it, but what could they do? Lordy massy, what can any on us do? There's places where folks just lets go, 'cause they has to. Things ain't as they want 'em, and they can't alter 'em. Sailors ain't so rough as they look. They's feelin' critters, come to put things right to 'em. And there wasn't one on 'em who wouldn't 'a' worked all night for a chance of savin' some of them poor fellas. But there 'twas. 'Twan't no use tryin'. Well, so they sailed on, and by the wind kind of chopped round northeast, and they come round east, and sot in for one of them regular east blows and drizzles that takes the starch out of fellers more'n a regular storm. So they concluded they might as well put into a little bay there, and come to anchor. So they sot an anchor watch, and all turned in. Well, now comes the particular curious part of Tom's story, and it was more curious 'cause Tom was the one that wouldn't have believed no other man that had told it. Tom was one of your sort of philosophers. He was for looking into things, and he wasn't in no hurry about believing, so that this'n was more remarkable on account of its being Tom that seen it than if it had been others. Tom says that night he had a pesky toothache that sort of kept grumbling and jumping, so he couldn't go to sleep, and he lay in his bunk, a-turning this way and that, till long past 12 o'clock. Tom had a thwart-ship bunk where he could see into every bunk on board except Bob Coffin's, and Bob was on the anchor watch. Well, he lay there trying to go to sleep, hearing the men snoring like bullfrogs in a swamp, and watching the lantern a-swinging back and forward, and the southwesters and pea-jackets were kind of throwing their long shadders up and down as the vessel sort of rolled and pitched, for there was a heavy swell on. And then he'd hear Bob Coffin tramp, tramp, tramping overhead, for Bob had a pretty heavy foot of his own, and all sort of mixed up together with Tom's toothache, so he couldn't get to sleep. Finally, Tom, he bit off a great chaw of baccy, and got it well sot in his cheek, and kind of turned over to lie on it and ease the pain. Well, he says he laid a spell, and dropped off in a sort of doze, when he woke in such a chill his teeth chattered, and the pain come on like a knife, and he bounced over, thinking the fire had gone out in the stove. Well, sure enough, he see a man a-crouching over the stove, with his back to him, a-stretching out his hands to warm 'em. He had on a southwester and a pea jacket with a red tippet around his neck, and his clothes was dripping as if he'd just come in from a rain. "What the devil?" says Tom, and he riz right up and rubbed his eyes. "Bill Bridges," says he, "what shine be you up to now?" For Bill was a master uneasy critter, and allers a-getting up and walking nights, and Tom he thought it was Bill. But in a minute he looked over, and there, sure enough, was Bill, fast asleep in his bunk, mouth wide open, snoring like a Jericho ram's horn. Tom looked round and counted every man in his bunk, and then he says, "Who the devil is this? For there's Bob Coffin on deck, and the rest is all here." Well, Tom weren't a man to be put under too easy. He had his thoughts about him allers, and the first he thought in every pinch was what to do. So he sot considering a minute, sort of winking his eyes to be sure he saw straight, when, sure enough, there come another man backing down the companionway. "Well, there's Bob Coffin anyhow," says Tom to himself. But no, the other man, he turned. Tom see his face, and sure as you live, it was the face of a dead corpse. Its eyes was sot, and it just came as still across the cabin and sot down by the stove and kind of shivered and put out its hands as if it was getting warm. Tom said that there was a cold air around in the cabin, as if an iceberg was coming near, and he felt cold chills running down his back. But he jumped out of his bunk and took a step forward. "Speak," says he. "Who be you, and what do you want?" They never spoke, nor looked up, but kept kind of shivering and crouching over the stove. "Well," says Tom, "I'll see who you be, anyhow." And he walked right up to the last man that come in and reached out to catch hold of his coat collar, but his hand just went through him like moonshine, and in a minute he all faded away. And when he turned round, the other one was gone too. Tom stood there, looking this way and that, but there weren't nothing but the old stove and the lantern swinging, and the men all snoring round in their bunks. Tom, he sung out to Bob Coffin. "Hello, up there," says he. But Bob never answered, and Tom went up and found Bob on his knees, his teeth a-chattering like a bag of nails, trying to say his prayers, and all he could think of was, "Now I lay me," and he kept going that over and over. You see, boys, Bob was a dreadful, wicked, swearing critter, and hadn't said no prayers since he was 2 years old, and it didn't come natural to him. "Hold your yap," said he. "What you howling about? What's up?" "Oh, Lordy massy," says Bob. "We're sent for, all on us. There's been 2 on 'em. Both on 'em went right by me." Well, Tom had his own thoughts, but he was bound to get to the bottom of things anyway. If 'twas the devil, well and good. He wanted to know it. Tom just wanted to have the matter settled one way or t'other, so he got Bob sort of stroked down and made him tell what he saw. Bob, he stood to it that he was a-standing right forward, a-leaning on the windlass, and kind of humming a tune, when he looked down and see a sort of queer light in the fog, and he went and took a look over the bows, when up came a man's head in a sort of southwester, and then a pair of hands and catched at the bobstay, and then the whole figure of the man riz right out of the water and clim up on the martingale till he could reach the jibstay with his hands, and then he swung himself right up onto the bowsprit and stepped aboard, and went past Bob right aft and down into the cabin. And he hadn't more'n got down afore he turned round, and there was another coming in over the bowsprit, and he went by him and down below. So there was 2 on 'em, just as Tom had seen in the cabin. Tom, he studied on it a spell, and finally says he, "Bob, let you and me keep this year to ourselves and see if it'll come again. If it don't, well and good. If it does, why, we'll see about it." But Tom, he told Captain Witherspoon, and the captain he agreed to keep an eye out the next night, but there weren't nothing said to the rest of the men. Well, the next night they put Bill Bridges on the watch. The fog had lifted, and they had a fair wind and was going on steady. The men all turned in and went fast asleep, except Captain Witherspoon, Tom, and Bob Coffin. Well, sure enough, 'twixt 12 and 1 o'clock, The same thing came over, only there was 4 men instead of 2. They come in just so over the bowsprit, and they looked neither to right nor left, but climb downstairs and sot down and crouched and shivered over the stove just like the others. Well, Bill Bridges, he came tearing down like a wildcat, frightened half out of his wits, screeching, "Lord have mercy, we're all going to the devil," and then they all vanished. "Now, Cap'n, what's to be done?" says Tom. "If these here fellers is to take passage, we can't do nothing with the boys, that's clear." Well, so it turned out, for come next night there was 6 on 'em come in, and the story got round, and the boys was all on end. There weren't no doing nothing with 'em. You see, it's allers just so. Not but what dead folks is just as 'spectable as they was afore they's dead. These might have been as good fellers as any aboard, but it's human nature. The minute a feller's dead, why, you sorter don't know about him, and it's kind of scary having on him round, so 'twan't no wonder the boys didn't feel as if they could go on with the voyage if these here fellows was all to take passage. Come to look, too, there were considerable of a leak stove in the vessel, and the boys they all stood to it that if they went further they'd all go to the bottom. For, you see, once the story got a-going, every one on 'em saw a new thing every night. One on 'em saw the bait mill a-grinding, with no hands to grind it, and another saw fellers up aloft working in the sails. Well, the fact were, they just had to put about, run back to Castine. Well, the owners, they hushed up things as best they could, and they put the vessel on the stocks and worked her over and put a new coat of paint on her and called her the Betsy Ann, and she went a good voyage to the bank and brought home the biggest fare of fish that had been for a long time, and she's made good voyages ever since. And that just proves what I've been a-saying, that there's nothing to drive out ghosts like fresh paint. End of section 12. Tom Toothacre's Ghost Story.